They say the dead keep their secrets, but here, in the hills of Tennessee, the ground speaks louder than the living. 29 graves, unmarked, swallowed by weeds and wild briar, lie behind the rotting remains of a once-beloved inn. Locals call it Rosehill Lodge. They whisper about the sisters who ran it, how they smiled like saints and welcomed travelers like brothers, how no man ever thought to fear them, until it was far too late. If you stand there at night, on the uneven earth where the graves sink into the soil, you can feel it. The faintest hollowness beneath your feet, as if the ground itself resents the weight of its own truth. And if you wait long enough, listening past the wind and the whip-poor-wills, you'll swear you can hear voices, not screams, but the soft, intimate tones of people who thought they were safe. The official history says Rosehill Lodge was a beacon of warmth for weary travelers heading west in the mid-19th century, a place of firelight, clean beds, and generous meals. But the history you've been told is a lie. The truth is buried, not just in the soil, but in the way this country teaches you to trust certain kinds of people. The Whitfield sisters understood this better than anyone. They knew how to disarm a man, not with weapons, but with attention. They knew how to make him believe he was more than just a paying guest, that he was understood, valued, even loved. And that is why the men never saw it coming. We're about to walk through the front door of Rosehill Lodge together. I will show you what no official record dared to say, but I warn you, this is not a story you can unknow. Once you see how the sisters worked, you will never again believe in kindness without suspicion. Now, step inside. The smell hits you first, not the rot of decay. They were far too careful for that, but the faint mingling of wood smoke, baked bread, and something sweeter, almost floral. A scent that told every weary man who crossed the threshold, you have arrived at the safest place in Tennessee. Margaret Whitfield, the eldest, was always the first face a traveler saw. Her eyes carried that subtle calculation you only notice in hindsight, weighing your clothes, your gait, the way your hand rests on your satchel, every detail filed away in an instant. She didn't need to ask what you were worth, she could see it. Beside her, Eleanor, the quiet one, had a way of making you feel seen without a word. She could hold a man's gaze half a heartbeat too long, then look away as if she'd just been caught admiring him. It was a small thing, but it stayed in the mind and opened the door for more. Rosehill Lodge was built for comfort, but comfort with intent. The long common table at the center wasn't just for meals, it was for listening. The sisters sat with guests, leaning close enough to catch stray words between bites. Where were they from? Who waited for them? How long until they were expected to return? Upstairs, the rooms had thick quilts and curtains heavy enough to blot out the moon. Privacy, the kind a man doesn't just appreciate, he trusts. That trust was the currency the Whitfields craved most. They never rushed. Some men were ready to be taken within 2 nights. Others needed a week. But once a sister had found the right opening, a lonely confession by the hearth, a careless boast after too much whiskey, the man's fate was sealed, though he wouldn't feel the noose tightening until the final hour. And here's what you must understand. This wasn't random. It was a system, calculated, tested, refined. The sisters didn't just run an inn. They ran a trap so perfectly constructed that even the survivors never suspected they'd brushed against death. You can almost hear the first question every victim was asked, casual but cutting. And who will be missing you while you're gone? They weren't asking out of concern, they were asking to see how quietly you could vanish. Other words, perfect. He arrived on a cold March evening in 1851, his boots caked with river mud, his breath clouding in the fading light. Margaret met him at the door as though she had been expecting him. She took his coat, her fingers brushing the heavy bulge in his inner pocket just long enough to confirm it wasn't a Bible. Dinner that night was venison stew with hot cornbread and blackberry preserves. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand lightly grazing his forearm whenever she laughed at his stories. She didn't just look at him when he spoke. She looked into him, making Silas feel like every word he uttered carried weight. After the meal, they led him to the hearth, where the firelight softened the sharp lines of the sisters' faces. Margaret poured whiskey with a smile that made men forget the miles they still needed to travel, and when Eleanor brought out her fiddle and played slow, aching tunes from the old country, something in Silas loosened. He began talking about his years on the road, about the silence of his cabin when he returned from a trip, about how sometimes he wished there was someone to greet him at the door. Margaret nodded as if she understood. "The road will take everything from you if you let it," she said quietly. "But here, you're among friends." The next morning, Silas decided to stay just one more night. The sisters made sure it was a night worth staying for. On the third night, he didn't wake up. Sarah, the youngest, had laced his final glass of whiskey with just enough tincture of foxglove to still the strongest heart. By dawn, his chest no longer rose, and his eyes stared at the rafters as if they'd caught a glimpse of something no man should see. They buried him before midday in the small patch behind the lodge. No questions, no prayers, just another mound of earth among the Whitfield dead. By sundown, his gold lay locked in Margaret's chest, and the sisters were ready for the next traveler. The Millbrook Inn was never meant to be a grand place. It was a resting stop, a warm hearth between long stretches of dirt road and wilderness. Travelers, merchants, drifters, lovers running from disapproving families were welcomed with a fire, bread, and the soft smiles of the two sisters who ran it. But in the town of Brindle Hollow, they whispered something else. They said the beds in the upper hall always seemed too cold the next morning, that the windows, though latched, would bang open in the dead of night, as though something inside was desperate to escape. One farmhand, Thomas Avery, claimed he stayed at the inn in the winter of 1850. He swore that when he awoke, he found faint words scratched into the wood beside his bed, "You're next." No one believed him until he vanished the following year. The graves behind the inn, 43 in total, weren't hidden. They sat neatly in rows, each marked with a small wooden cross. The sisters told anyone who asked that they were poor souls who had died of sickness, accidents, or the long cold nights. But a traveling preacher, Reverend Cole, kept a small leather journal. In it, he wrote of the smell that lingered in the air near those graves, not the scent of decay, but something far more metallic. By the time he returned with the sheriff, the journal would be all that remained of him. The sisters claimed he never stayed there. And yet, the townsfolk still remember hearing the heavy thud of a body being dragged across the floorboards that night. The Millbrook Inn remained open for another 12 years, and countless more guests who never left. By night, the Millbrook Inn was not a place of rest. It was a stage. Shadows from the hallway lanterns stretched like skeletal fingers across peeling wallpaper. The scent of whiskey, pipe smoke, and something far less pleasant clung to the air. Each creak of the staircase carried with it a question. Was it the footstep of a guest, or of someone who would never leave? Travelers who stayed here often spoke of the uncanny hospitality of the sisters. They never asked for payment in advance. They greeted strangers by name without ever having been introduced, and they always insisted on offering their own homemade nightcap, a sweet, spiced cordial served in delicate glass cups. But the locals whispered about what came after that cordial. Some guests would vanish without a word, leaving all their belongings behind. Others left in the morning, pale, trembling, unable to recall the night before, only the image of one of the sisters standing at the foot of their bed, watching. Strangely, the inn never ran out of supplies, even in lean seasons. The sisters' clothes were finer than any other woman's in Millbrook, their jewelry glinting with gemstones no one could place, and in the back gardens, hidden behind a locked gate, were rows of freshly turned earth. Too many rows for a family of 3. Years later, those rows would be counted, 43 in all, 43 graves, unmarked, unnamed, buried in silence beneath the Kentucky soil. And still, to this day, there's no official record of who they were or why they never left the Millbrook Inn. The sisters claimed it was all just bad luck. The sheriff called it wandering souls with weak hearts. But the old men at the tavern, they knew. They swore the sisters didn't just feed the guests, they fed on them. By the time the sheriff arrived, the sisters were nowhere to be found. Their chairs were still warm, as if they had just stood up a moment before, but the rest of the inn felt frozen in time. The only place left unchecked was the attic, a narrow, suffocating crawl space that locals claimed no guest had ever entered and returned unchanged. The floorboards groaned under the sheriff's boots as he climbed, his lantern swaying in the blackness. With each step, the air grew heavier, as though the house itself was holding its breath. He reached the door, its warped wood covered in deep scratches, not from the outside, but from within. When he turned the iron handle, the hinges let out a sound that was almost a scream. Inside, the attic was lined with dusty trunks, each labeled with the names of guests who had stayed at the inn, names that matched several of the headstones outside. On one trunk, written in faint, trembling ink, was a fresh addition, his own name. Then came the whispers. They slid from the shadows, curling around his ears, speaking in voices both sweet and venomous. "Stay with us. Rest here forever." The light from his lantern flickered wildly, casting glimpses of figures standing in the corners, faces he recognized from missing persons posters, their eyes hollow, yet pleading. The sheriff backed toward the stairs, but the attic door slammed shut, the latch clicking from the inside. The whispers turned into soft laughter, a chorus of women's voices, and for the first time in his career, the sheriff realized he wasn't here to make an arrest. He was here to be claimed. When the sheriff's men finally turned their attention to the heavy oak desk in the corner of the parlor, they expected to find a few routine papers. Guest lists, bills, supply orders. What they discovered instead was something no one in Milford would speak of openly for decades. The desk drawers had been nailed shut from the inside, a crude but deliberate act. It took 3 men with crowbars to pry them open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to resist the damp, was a single ledger bound in dark leather. The cover bore no title, only a small, pressed flower, now dried and crumbling with age. The handwriting inside was meticulous, each entry starting with a date followed by a name, a place of origin, and a strange symbol in the margin. Some were crosses, some a crescent moon, others were unrecognizable marks that no one could identify. But then came the most disturbing detail. Beside certain names was a second date, often just days after the first, and beside those second dates a short word in an elegant but cold script. Gone. The sheriff read through dozens of such entries, his face growing paler with each page. The book didn't read like an inn's guest register. It read like a record of disappearances. There were 43 such marked names in total, the same number as the graves that had been found behind the inn. No one knew who had kept this ledger. No one dared ask whether the sisters themselves had written it or merely preserved it. But one thing was clear. The deaths were not the result of random tragedy. They were organized, tracked, accounted for. And if the ledger's final blank pages were any indication, the record keeper had intended for the list to grow much longer. The sheriff's handwriting was as rigid and cold as the man himself. In the county records room, lit by a single swaying oil lamp, the pages of his ledger lay open like a confession waiting to be read. Each line bore a date, a name, and the same chilling phrase scrawled beside it: "No inquiry made." It wasn't just a bureaucratic oversight, it was an orchestrated silence. 4 guests in 1 month, all marked "no inquiry." A drifter from Tennessee, a salesman from Missouri, a widow from Cincinnati, and a young couple whose names were never even recorded. The sheriff had written the words in ink so dark it had bled into the paper, as though he wanted permanence. Beside one entry, however, there was something different. A jagged note in the margin. Sisters claim kindness, evidence inconclusive. This was the only mention of the Cunningham women in any official record from that year, and it was buried halfway through a log of livestock disputes and petty thefts. But here's where the ledger turned from troubling to terrifying. On the final page for 1851, beneath the sheriff's signature, there was a hand that wasn't his. The script was smaller, almost trembling, and it read, "They will keep feeding the soil until someone stops them." That line had no initials, no indication of who had written it. It looked as though it had been added after hours, perhaps by a clerk who realized too late what they were witnessing. And yet, the sheriff kept the book. He didn't destroy it. He didn't lock it away. He left it sitting there, waiting for the next set of eyes to find it. It wasn't a mistake. It was an invitation. By the summer of 1852, the Millbrook Inn had gained a quiet reputation, one not spoken in polite company, but whispered in the back pews of churches and in the hushed corners of taverns. Travelers came and went, but the townsfolk kept careful count, and not everyone who arrived was ever seen leaving. Ledger books from that year, still faintly inked with a clerk's meticulous handwriting, show a troubling pattern. Names written in neat columns, accompanied by dates of arrival, yet for dozens of them, no record of departure. Rooms that had been occupied for weeks suddenly listed as vacant overnight, with no mention of payment or checkout. Locals spoke of the sisters' kindness, their way of making guests feel so at home that they never wanted to leave. But behind the charm was a strange habit. They insisted on serving tea themselves, never allowing guests to fetch their own water from the pump. A cup placed in front of you was to be finished, no questions asked. Those who hesitated were met with a sweet but unyielding smile, as if refusing would be unwise. One farmhand claimed to have delivered supplies late one evening and seen a pale figure in the courtyard, being half dragged, half carried toward the cellar by two women. The man swore it was a guest he'd seen earlier that day, but when he told the sheriff, he was told, "Best you forget it, son. The sisters do a lot for this town." In the following months, a pattern emerged. Merchants in nearby towns began noticing abandoned wagons left by the roadside. Letters addressed to Millbrook guests went unanswered. Families from far-off states wrote inquiries about loved ones last seen heading toward Kentucky, inquiries that were never returned. The sisters' warm hospitality had become a trap, a velvet snare that few recognized until it was far too late. The inn's door was easy to enter, but for some, impossibly hard to leave. 3 days after the discovery of the cellar, Reverend Mallory, a man known for preaching about sin but never about redemption, arrived unannounced. He claimed he'd been summoned by the Lord after a vision in which the Millbrook Inn glowed red against the night sky. He asked to be alone in the eastern hallway, the one guests rarely entered. No one followed him at first. It was Henry Broad, the young farmhand, who saw him pulling at the paneling near the baseboard. Dust rose in the dim light, and soon the Reverend extracted a bundle wrapped in oilcloth bound tightly with black thread. He did not open it there. He slipped it into his coat and turned, startled to see Henry. But later that night, Henry's curiosity burned through his fear. He crept into the Reverend's rented room, waited until the man went to evening prayer, and unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a single sheet of yellowing paper, not a sermon, not a prayer, but a letter written in a spidery hand addressed to the Sisters of Millbrook in the event that love turns to hunger. The first line alone made Henry's stomach knot. "We cannot let them leave. The town will not understand. They must rest here with the others." Beneath those words were numbers 43. Underlined twice. The ink bled at the edges, as if damp with time. Henry didn't hear the Reverend return, but he felt the hand on his shoulder, cold, heavy. The Reverend's whisper was almost kind. "You shouldn't have read that, boy. Now you understand why some graves are never marked." That night, Henry packed his belongings and fled Millbrook. He was the last outsider to leave alive. The Reverend stayed, the letter disappeared, and the wall where it had been hidden was sealed again, with plaster the color of bone. The chapel's walls had been scrubbed clean. Every painting, every wooden carving, every trace of its former purpose had been stripped away. But the stone itself, the stone still remembered. You could feel it in the air, a weight that pressed against your chest, a heaviness that didn't belong to the present moment. There were no prayers here anymore, no sermons, only silence. Yet that silence seemed almost alive, as if it had teeth. Father Aldrich placed his hand on the cold surface of the altar, and in that instant something inside him shifted. He later described it as a memory not my own. He saw flashes, not visions, but impressions, as if the chapel were replaying its past. Shadows of hooded figures moving in the candlelight, the muffled sobs of someone bound and kneeling, the sharp smell of burning wax mixed with something far darker. He tried to pull his hand away, but something, not a physical force, but a will, kept it there. The stone seemed to hum faintly beneath his palm. And then he heard it. A whisper. Not from behind him, not from the wind, but from within the wall itself. Words so faint he could barely make them out, yet their meaning struck deep. They didn't leave. They are still here. A rush of cold flooded his veins. The chapel was not abandoned. It was not empty. It was inhabited, but not by the living. Father Aldrich staggered back, clutching his chest. The air was suddenly thicker, the shadows longer. The walls had spoken, and what they said made him realize the chapel was not a place you entered. It was a place that entered you. It arrived without a return address. A single envelope thick with age, its paper browned and brittle, edges curling inward like it had been waiting decades for someone to open it. The handwriting across the front was elegant, too elegant. The kind of penmanship you see in the archives of 19th century estates, not in a modern mailbox. The name written there was yours, and yet you'd never told anyone the name you'd been using to investigate the Whittaker Mill. When the narrator in this story, the one guiding you, opens the seal, there's no sound of tearing, no satisfying rip of paper, just silence, like the air around it has been stolen away. Inside is a single folded sheet, covered in ink so faint it's almost invisible. But as your eyes adjust, the words bleed into clarity. The first line reads, "You're looking in the wrong century." The rest is stranger, fragmented sentences, incomplete dates, lists of names you've never heard. But one stands out. The night of the turning wheel. No history book records such an event. No archive mentions it, and yet, scribbled below the phrase is a warning written with such force the pen tore through the paper. Do not ask the last Whittaker. It's only then you notice the bottom corner of the letter. Wet. Not with ink, not with water, but with something dark, rusty, and almost dry. You shouldn't keep reading, but you do, and the final line freezes the breath in your lungs. You've already been inside the mill, you just don't remember. The letter burns cold in your hand, and the walls feel closer now. Somewhere, unseen, the turning of a wheel begins. If you want, I can make section 13 even more disturbing, where the last W. By the time the sheriff's men stepped inside the residence, the clock on the wall had stopped, its brass pendulum frozen mid-swing, as though time itself had refused to proceed. The first room they entered reeked faintly of lilac water, but beneath it was something heavier, sweet and metallic. The carpets were immaculate, yet the air was so still it seemed to resist breath. In the parlor, a half-knitted shawl lay draped over an armchair, the needle still in place, one loop of yarn hanging loose as if the hands that worked it had simply vanished mid-motion. A single teacup rested on the low table, its surface glazed with a thin white film. The tea inside was cold, yet the steam stains on the porcelain looked fresh. One deputy swore he heard faint footsteps upstairs, but when they checked, every room was empty, except for the far corner of the attic. There, a child's wooden cradle sat under the sloped ceiling, shrouded in dust. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in old linens. When the sheriff leaned close to inspect, he realized the bundle contained no child at all, only a lock of hair tied with black ribbon and a brittle scrap of paper with a name scrawled across it. The name was hers. Outside, the townsfolk waited, craning their necks for news. But when the men emerged, their faces were pale, their eyes refusing to meet the crowd. They carried nothing in their hands, not even the paper. Whatever they had found, they had decided to keep it between themselves. The door to the house was locked, nailed shut, and a crude warning was etched into the wood. No one sleeps here. The townsfolk obeyed. For decades afterward, people crossed the street to avoid even looking at the windows, and those who did glance too long claimed to see someone standing in the parlor, motionless, watching, long after the family had been erased from history. By the autumn of 1889, the whispers had shifted from mere gossip to something sharper: warnings. In the back room of a dockside tavern, a man named Elias Cole pressed a folded scrap of paper into my palm. His hand trembled and his eyes darted toward the street as if every passerby might be listening. "Don't read it here," he muttered, "and for God's sake burn it after." When I unfolded it later, by the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, I found not sentences but a series of strange symbols, an archaic script I'd only seen once before, in the margins of an 1823 ledger from the Newport Maritime office. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not a letter, it was a cipher. The last time I had seen it, the message had been a manifest listing the unclaimed cargo of ships that never docked and crewmen who never returned. But here, the symbols didn't refer to goods. They referenced people, names, dates, and one name was circled 3 times. Margaret Ashford, the very woman whose existence Newport had tried to erase. The implication was clear. She wasn't a victim of random fate. She was marked, recorded, tracked like contraband. But there was more. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in ink darker than the rest, were 4 words in plain English: "The chapel holds her." That chapel, the one on the hilltop with its blackened steeple and rusting bell, had been sealed for decades. Its doors chained, windows bricked, and the locals crossing themselves when they passed. If this cipher was to be believed, Margaret Ashford's story hadn't ended in the harbor. It had ended behind those locked chapel doors. And now I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, maybe Elias Cole, maybe something else, wanted me to go there. It began as a faint murmur. At first, the townsfolk thought it was the wind slipping through the gaps in the church's rotting shutters, but it wasn't the wind. Every night at the same hour, 3 minutes past 2, a single voice would begin to speak in the chapel. Not pray, not sing, speak. It was low, measured, deliberate, as if reciting a list that no one was meant to hear. Witnesses claimed the tone was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It had the strange, hollow cadence of something that had never been alive in the first place. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the whisper would stop. For a week, the town ignored it. For a month, they feared it. And then, it changed. One night, instead of stopping, the whisper rose. The words became rapid, urgent, tumbling over each other until the sound was no longer human speech, but a chaotic blend of snarls, gasps, and, according to the only man who dared to stay and listen, a scream. Not the scream of pain, not even the scream of fear, but the sound of something ancient and trapped finally realizing it had been found. By dawn, the church's great iron bell rang on its own, a sound that hadn't been heard in decades. The townspeople found the front doors ajar, the air inside suffocating and warm, as if the building itself had been holding its breath all night. On the altar lay a single page, yellowed and cracked, written in an unfamiliar script. Only one word was legible in English, and it was a name. The same name that had been scratched into the chapel floorboards back in 1856. The night after the public hearing, Father Elijah sat alone in the rectory's study. Outside, the storm had not ceased, wind hammering the shutters, rain thrashing against the stained glass. The candle before him flickered violently, as though it too felt the weight of what was about to be spoken. On the desk lay a stack of old parish records, the edges curled with damp, but beneath them, hidden under a false bottom drawer, was a letter sealed in wax. The crest was not of the church. It was an older symbol, circular, with a serpent swallowing its own tail. Elijah broke the seal with trembling hands. The letter was not recent. Its ink was faded, the script sharp and deliberate. It was addressed not to him, but to the keeper of the East Chapel. It spoke in veiled terms of the transaction of 1811 and the binding of 3 souls under the holy vault. At first, the language read like obscure theological metaphor. But as the paragraphs unfurled, the meaning became chillingly clear. This was a confession, not of sins, but of complicity. The author, whose name was never signed, described a pact made between the original founders of the chapel and an unnamed benefactor. The deal was simple and obscene. The chapel would receive land, influence, and endless donations. In return, the crypt beneath the altar would be sealed, and whatever lay within would remain untouched until the appointed year. But the most disturbing line was written at the bottom, almost as an afterthought. When the year comes, open the vault only in the presence of the serpent's mark, lest the watchers reclaim what is theirs. Elijah felt a coldness seep into his bones. It was no longer just about missing funds or secret tunnels. The chapel itself had been built on a bargain, one that still had not reached its end. Somewhere deep below, behind those locked stone doors, the appointed year was drawing near, and the watchers were waiting. At first glance it seemed harmless, a worn leather-bound ledger tucked into a hollow in the chapel wall, its edges blackened by moisture and time. But the weight of it was wrong. When Samuel lifted it, he swore he could feel a pulse through the cover, as if the paper inside was not merely documenting life, but feeding off it. The cover bore no title, just deep scratches, not from age but deliberate marks, made to obliterate something once written there. Inside, the handwriting shifted abruptly from neat and elegant to jagged and frantic. The first half chronicled ordinary parish accounts, weddings, baptisms, donations. Then, without warning, the tone changed. The entries became darker, naming individuals not for their ceremonies, but for their disappearance. Dates were recorded with precise times, and next to each a phrase in a language Samuel could not identify. Some names had been scratched out so violently that the page tore, leaving ragged holes where the ink once lay. Others were underlined in a trembling hand, as if someone had marked them for something. As Samuel turned the brittle pages, he noticed a repeated motif, a crude drawing of a seven-pointed star etched beside certain entries. Under one, written in fading red ink, was a name he recognized: Elijah Morwin, the very man whose body had never been found, but whose absence had shattered an entire congregation in 1864. The last page was unfinished, the final words trailing off mid-sentence. "The key is not in the chapel. The key is under the—" Before he could read more, a sudden gust slammed the chapel door shut behind him. The candle flickered violently, and the ledger's pages began turning on their own, stopping at a blank sheet. Except in the candlelight, faint writing began to bleed through from somewhere beneath the paper, as if the message had been burned into it from another reality. This was no record book. It was a ledger of the vanished. When the letter arrived, it bore no return address, no postage stamp, and no handwriting the family recognized. It had been slipped somehow into the locked front hallway without disturbing a single latch or hinge. The paper was thick, yellowed, not from age, but from something else, something like smoke. The writing inside was jagged, uneven, as though the pen had been forced across the page by a trembling hand. It read only, "She was taken by the same hands that once blessed her. Look for the room without windows. Look for the place where the walls remember." No name, no date, no indication of who had sent it. Martha Morwin's father crushed the paper in his fist before his wife could read it, muttering that it was the work of cruel pranksters, but his knuckles were white and his breath came shallow. The strange thing was, there had always been rumors about a room in the Morwin estate. A door that led nowhere, a chamber that appeared in one floor plan and disappeared in the next. Builders claimed it was sealed off during renovation. Servants whispered that voices could still be heard behind the plaster. For the first time, the family considered that the disappearance might not have been the work of an outsider at all. But the question was more terrible than any answer. If Martha had been taken inside the house, by whom? And why had the letter waited months to arrive? That night, a candle burned in the hallway outside the alleged sealed room. By morning, the candle was gone. The hallway smelled faintly of smoke, and where the candle had stood, there was a small patch of soot, shaped like a bare footprint. It began as a faint murmur in the distance, a sound no louder than the rustle of leaves in a dying wind. Yet it pierced the minds of those who heard it. Father Donnelly described it once in his journal. It was not sound. It was thought, entering me. Witnesses said the whisper came when the moonlight touched the cracked marble of the chapel floor. It would slip into the ear, coil around the mind, and tug at something primal, something buried in the marrow of the soul. The bishop insisted it was just the echo of the wind through the tower vents. But no wind could form words, and no breeze could call you by name in a voice belonging to someone who had been dead for decades. Over time, the whisper began to follow people home. Men who swore they were alone in their rooms heard it just before sleep. Soft, patient, insistent. Women in the marketplace said it rose from the stones beneath their feet, speaking in a tongue they did not know but somehow understood. And then came the sickness, not the kind that could be cured with rest or medicine, but the kind that pulled a man into himself, stripping away his will to speak, to eat, to live. The whisper, it seemed, was not merely a sound. It was an invitation to descend, to go where the chapel's foundation sank deeper than any builder claimed to have dug, and once you went down, you did not return. It was hours past midnight when a loud metallic crash echoed from beneath the floorboards. The sound jolted Eleanor awake, a sound she swore she had heard before. Not footsteps, not voices, but chains, rusted chains dragging against stone. She lit a single candle, the flame trembling almost as much as her hands, and crept toward the narrow door at the back of the kitchen, a door everyone else claimed led only to a disused pantry. The air grew colder with each step down the spiral stone staircase. The scent hit her first, damp rot, iron, and something faintly sweet like old perfume. She reached the bottom and found herself in a low-ceilinged cellar. The shadows pressed close around her. In the farthest corner she saw a shape, a woman's figure, half concealed by the dark. Her dress was shredded and centuries out of fashion, her hair tangled and streaked with silver. But it was her face that froze Eleanor in place. Pale as bone, eyes wide and glassy, as if they had been staring into the same darkness for decades. The woman didn't speak. She only lifted her hands. And Eleanor saw the shackles, their links corroded but still locked tight around her wrists. When Eleanor tried to step closer, the woman flinched, retreating further into the shadows, her voice breaking into a whisper. "They never let me leave. Not alive." Eleanor's candle flickered violently, and in the split second before it went out, she saw the truth. There were no walls behind the woman, only a black yawning void that seemed to breathe. Somewhere above them, a door slammed shut. It was well past midnight when I found it, a warped wooden crate, tucked behind a false wall in the old mayor's office, sealed so tightly it seemed more like a coffin than a container. Dust clung to its edges like it had been waiting for someone foolish enough to open it. The latch was brittle, but when it gave, the air that escaped was stale, almost sweet, and wrong. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a ledger, not an ordinary account book. This was something else. The pages weren't filled with numbers or taxes. No, this ledger named names, whole families, every entry marked with a date, a cryptic symbol, and a brief note, sometimes just a single word like cleansed or taken. And beside each name, an amount of money, large amounts, far larger than any small-town transaction should hold. But what made my hands go cold wasn't the list of the dead, it was the dates. Some of them hadn't happened yet. In one column, in faded brown ink, I saw an entry with my name. The date was 3 days from now. The note beside it? Just one word. Returned. That's when I heard the floorboards behind me shift, just slightly. No wind, no settling. This was the sound of weight being placed slowly, deliberately. Someone was in the room. I didn't turn around. My instinct told me that whatever stood behind me already knew what I'd found, and maybe, in some way, had been waiting for me to find it. Because the truth wasn't just in that ledger. The truth was in the fact that it had been left here for me. When the caretaker finally returned to the hall, he carried something wrapped in burlap and bound with twine. The fabric was darkened with the oil of decades, and the string frayed as if it had been gnawed by time itself. Without speaking, he placed it on the table between us and stepped back. His eyes were distant, almost afraid. When I untied the twine and peeled away the burlap, the smell hit me first. Damp parchment, old ink, and something faintly metallic, like dried blood. It was a ledger. The cover was blackened by soot, its corners burnt and brittle. The pages inside were filled with names, every single one written in the same precise hand, the ink still dark as if it refused to fade. But it wasn't a financial record. These were not numbers, not dates of trade or debt. They were names of people. People who were no longer alive. Some had notes beside them, cryptic symbols, a few phrases in Latin, and what looked like measurements. One column contained nothing but the same word, repeated again and again in a trembling hand. Taken. But what stopped me cold was the final entry. It was dated 3 days from now, and beneath it was my name. I looked up, but the caretaker had already stepped into the shadows of the corridor, his figure swallowed by the dim. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic creak of the building's beams, as if it too was counting down. I didn't yet understand what the ledger recorded, but deep in my gut, I knew this was no history book. It was a prophecy, and my time was running out. The ink had faded, but the meaning still struck like a blade. The final entries in Jonathan Calder's diary were dated 3 days before his disappearance. His once clear handwriting had become erratic, letters slanting upward as if written in haste, words scratched out, sentences unfinished. But the fragments that remained painted a portrait of a man cornered by forces both human and unseen. They know, the letters, not safe here. Even the pastor looks at me differently. He recited something under his breath that was not from the scriptures I know. I hear them outside at night, not footsteps, something heavier, a dragging. The entry stopped abruptly, replaced by a crude drawing, a spiral that tightened inward until it became nothing more than a dark blot of ink. Beneath it, a single line. If you see this, burn it. Do not go to the chapel after midnight. The chapel, the one in the center of town that no one dared enter after dusk, the one with the boarded windows as if light itself was being kept out, or something else kept in. More pages followed, but they were unlike anything else in the diary. Drawings of eyes in the margins, maps of the town with strange marks in red ink, and a list of 7 names. 4 had been crossed out, the remaining 3 were still alive. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned the last sheet. It wasn't paper, it was a fragment of what looked like old parchment, brittle and yellowed. Written in an older, almost ceremonial script were the words, "We did not bury him. We could not." And then, silence. No signature. No date. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the loose shutters. It was the same wind she had heard when she first opened the box, the kind that carried warnings or invitations. It was not the kind of map you would find in any library or church archive. This one was hand-drawn on brittle parchment, ink faded but not erased, with markings that seemed more like warnings than directions. Each curve of the river was exaggerated, each ridge of the hills drawn like a jagged scar, and scattered across the terrain were tiny black crosses, each one positioned where a body had been found. Some were fresh discoveries from the past decade, others marked places where old bones had been unearthed by farmers, miners, or wandering children who stumbled where they should never have gone. The Morwins had kept this map in their possession for over a century, and no one knew why. Beneath the symbols, written in a script so delicate it could have been mistaken for decoration, was a single Latin phrase, "Custos non dormit." The guardian does not sleep. No scholar could agree on the meaning. Some said it was a reminder to keep watch. Others insisted it meant the land itself was alive, that something under the soil remained aware of every trespass. When the map was accidentally shown to an outsider, a cartographer from Philadelphia who had been cataloging old settlements, he vanished within the week. His last known letter was addressed to a friend, and in it he wrote, "The hills here are not right. They echo when there is no sound, and I swear to you, the earth shifts when I am not looking." After his disappearance, the Morwins sealed the map in a box lined with lead and kept it in the locked room behind the chapel. The townspeople claimed that on certain nights the ink glowed faintly, as if the crosses themselves were burning from within. No one dared to test if the guardian still watched. The folded paper was wedged between the warped floorboards of what had once been the study. It was brittle, its edges eaten away by years of moisture and insects. But what made my pulse slow to a crawl wasn't its age. It was the ink. The words were written in a red so deep, so vivid, that for a moment I wondered if it was still wet. The handwriting was elegant but unnervingly precise, each curve and line suggesting a deliberate control. The letter began with an address. "To the next one who finds this." My breath caught. It spoke of a pact, an agreement signed not in trust but in desperation. The author claimed to have been one of 7, each bound to a single command: protect the door, no matter the cost. But as the years passed, something came through that door, something patient, something hungry. The writer described hearing it first in the rafters, then in the walls, and finally whispering from inside their own thoughts. It promised freedom, it promised power, and one by one the others vanished, either into the night or into the walls themselves. The letter ended with a single slashed line across the page. "When you read this, it will know you are here." The air in the room shifted. The boards beneath my feet felt warmer. Behind me, a faint creak. It wasn't the wind. By the final week of December, the mansion's air felt heavier, almost wet, as if the walls themselves had begun to sweat under the strain of keeping its secrets. The men who had once moved through these halls with calculated precision now spoke in hushed tones, their glances darting toward the corners where no one stood. It was then that Caleb learned of the oath beneath the floorboards. It happened in the dead of night. 4 men, faces obscured by shadow, entered the drawing room carrying a small iron chest. The chest was locked with a mechanism older than any safe Caleb had ever seen, its surface etched with symbols he had once glimpsed in the archives of a forgotten monastery. They did not open it. Instead, they pried up the warped oak planks at the center of the room, revealing a cavity no larger than a coffin. One by one they removed objects from within, a silver crucifix blackened with age, a bundle of letters bound in red ribbon, and a small glass jar containing something that moved. The movement was slow, deliberate, and wrong, as though whatever lived inside it did not belong to this century or this world. The 4 men placed the new chest into the cavity and, without speaking, placed their hands atop it. Caleb, hiding behind the velvet curtains, strained to hear the words they muttered. The language was neither English nor Latin, yet the syllables scraped against his mind like a blade against bone. The air in the room seemed to twist, the candle flames bowing as if in submission. When they were done, they sealed the planks back into place, leaving no visible trace. But Caleb noticed, beneath the boards, a faint glow, pulsing like the breath of something waiting to be freed. And as the men left, the oldest among them paused, staring at the very curtain where Caleb hid, his mouth curling into a smile that was not a smile at all. Something told Caleb that whatever was locked beneath those floorboards was never meant to stay there forever. There are vows that are spoken for show, recited with trembling lips before a congregation, meant to impress the devout. And then there are oaths taken in places where God's eyes feel absent, where the air is heavy enough to choke, and the words bind not just flesh and blood, but the very soul. In the months following their seclusion, whispers began to circulate among the few who dared walk near the locked convent. They spoke of an oath of silence. Not the quiet discipline of monastic life, but a vow sealed with something far darker. No scripture was read, no priest presided. Instead, it was said the nuns stood barefoot in a circle deep within the crypt, each with a single black candle. The walls dripped with condensation, the air thick with the scent of rotting stone and old incense. There, they uttered the words that no one outside those walls ever heard in full, but fragments leaked, passed from servant to trader, from trader to sailor, from sailor to stranger in a tavern. The fragments spoke of binding the tongue, of sewing the soul shut, of keeping the master's final truth untouched until the grave. Some claimed they had to slice their own palms and let their blood drip into a single basin, mixing into one, as if their very lives were now shared and sealed. But the part that unsettled even the most skeptical listeners was the rumor that this oath was not meant to expire in death. It was to be carried through death into whatever awaited them beyond, a vow that would cling to them like a shadow in the afterlife. And if that was true, it meant that somewhere, in some realm we cannot see, those 14 silent women might still be holding their tongues, waiting for the day when the one they served calls them to speak. The question was, what could possibly be worth guarding for eternity? By late autumn, the villagers whispered that the ground itself was rejecting her. The grave, placed on the outer edge of the old cemetery, where the soil was damp and the fog hung low, had been sealed 3 times. Yet each time, within days, the earth would sink in unnaturally, as though something inside had shifted or moved. The caretaker swore he had tamped the dirt firm, but on the morning of November 3rd, he found the coffin lid cracked, not from rot, but from pressure pushing outward. The priest ordered the grave filled again, muttering prayers so quickly they blurred together. No one lingered that day, but the people of the village were not fools. They knew the old stories, that some dead are not at rest, that they can be bound only by rites long forbidden by the church. And they knew the rites had never been done. Children were warned to stay away from the cemetery, but children never listen. 2 boys, curious and reckless, crept in one night under the silver light of a cloudless moon. They returned home pale, trembling, unable to speak. When one finally stammered out what they'd seen, his father struck him for blasphemy, but the boy insisted. He saw her, standing at the edge of her own grave, head turned toward the village, lips moving without sound. The next day, her stone marker was gone. No one claimed responsibility. No one even admitted to seeing it removed. The villagers avoided that part of the cemetery entirely now, though some swore they could still feel her presence, watching from somewhere just beyond sight. And in the weeks that followed, doors began to rattle in their frames at night, even when the wind was still. The fire in the hearth had long died. Only the sound of dripping water echoed through the Morwen estate's underground chamber. By the dim glow of a single lantern, I turned the final page of the ledger, the one so carefully hidden that even the family's most loyal servants swore it was only a myth. The ink was faint, almost erased, as if the very words fought to vanish, but they remained. Sentences written in a cramped, frantic hand. They weren't records of money, land, or names. They were confessions. Every unspeakable act the Morwens had committed was laid out in chilling detail. Bribes to bishops, disappearances of rivals, rituals performed under the cover of plague nights. One entry stopped my breath, dated the night before the fire that consumed half the village in 1834. It claimed the flames were no accident. They were a cleansing, a calculated act to silence the sick and the dissenters before they could speak of what they had seen in the chapel's cellar. The deeper I read, the more I realized these weren't just the actions of desperate aristocrats. No, the handwriting shifted midway through, the second half penned by someone else, someone whose identity was signed only with a symbol. That same symbol was carved into the stones outside the estate, into the altar of the chapel, into the coffin of the first Morwen patriarch. When I closed the ledger, the lantern flickered, casting long skeletal shadows across the walls. The air felt heavier. The smell of smoke, old, bitter, and impossible, seemed to seep from the pages, and in that moment I understood. This book wasn't a record, it was a key, and once you read it, you couldn't unsee the truth. Some doors once opened will never close again. Night deepened over Ashford, but the air inside the inn felt heavier than any storm. The men who had once mocked Henry now avoided his gaze entirely. Even the bravest among them refused to speak of the sound they had all heard the night before. The slow, dragging shuffle of boots across the frozen road, stopping just beyond the door. Henry sat alone in the corner, his cup untouched. The candle beside him burned low, its wax spilling in jagged rivers. From time to time his eyes would shift to the door, then to the darkened window, as if he were listening for something the rest could not hear. When a traveler from a distant village arrived that evening bringing news, the room went silent. The man spoke in a halting voice, as though saying the words out loud made them dangerous. "In the marsh beyond the chapel," he began, "we found footprints, but they weren't right. They circled in on themselves. No start, no end, just walking in a loop." The innkeeper's wife crossed herself. A few of the older patrons stood, muttering excuses as they hurried out into the night, preferring the cold to whatever conversation might follow. Henry finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "It's not gone," he said. "It's waiting." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of something heavy moving through wet earth. No one dared check the window. The candle sputtered, and in that brief moment of darkness, the entire room felt as though the walls had drawn closer. And for the first time in decades, Henry's eyes betrayed fear, not for himself, but for what the rest of them could no longer avoid. The streets of Fairford had grown quieter, almost unnaturally so, as if the town itself was holding its breath. By now, only the most determined dared to speak the Morwen name aloud, and even they whispered it like a curse. But one thing had become undeniable. The family's grip had begun to loosen, not because they were defeated, but because their work was nearly complete. The last surviving elder, Agnes Morwen, had not been seen for months. Her townhouse, once a place of constant comings and goings, was shuttered, the windows layered in dust. The curious who approached claimed to hear something faint inside, a low, rhythmic sound, not unlike breathing, though deeper, more resonant. A sound that didn't belong to anything human. Somewhere in that house, locked away from the world, Agnes was said to be completing the binding. No one knew exactly what it meant, but old pages from the Morwen archives hinted at a ritual centuries in the making. A weaving of names, memories, and bloodlines into something eternal. Once sealed, it would not just preserve their legacy, it would overwrite the memory of Fairford itself. And yet, there were cracks. A servant's journal, smuggled out by a distant cousin, described Agnes's nightly fits, moments when she would awaken screaming, her mouth full of soil, clawing at her own arms as if to tear something out from beneath the skin. Whatever she had called forth into herself was fighting back. For the first time, there was a chance, a sliver of weakness in a fortress that had stood for generations. But it came with a warning scratched into the servant's last page. If you break the binding, it does not die. It escapes. Fairford was approaching its last dawn as the world knew it. Someone had to decide, let the Morwen design complete, or risk releasing something far worse into the open air. The lantern light flickers. The air is thick with the smell of damp stone and something far older than dust. You stand at the threshold, the last piece of the puzzle trembling in your hands. Every lie, every whisper, every buried document, they all point here. To this moment, the question is no longer what happened, it's why it was allowed to happen. You realize now, this was never just about the disappearance, not just about one family, one town, or even one century. This was a warning carved into the bones of history. Those in power do not erase the past because they fear its shame. They erase it because the past contains weapons, weapons in the form of knowledge, truths that, if remembered, could shatter their control. And in the quiet hum of your own heartbeat, you feel the weight of the decision pressing in. You could walk away, let the silence consume these revelations, as it has consumed so many before you. Or, you could drag this truth into the light, knowing that once it's seen, there is no going back. Your breath fogs in the cold air. Behind you, the wind howls like the voices of those who never got to speak. Ahead, the shadows ripple as though something in the darkness has been waiting for you to decide. Somewhere deep in the stone, you think you hear it, the faintest sound of metal against metal, chains loosening. If you choose to speak, the world will never be the same. If you stay silent, you'll become part of the very machine you swore to expose. The choice was never really yours alone.